Welcome to this screencast on developing with the Microsoft Graph. Let me first talk a little bit about what this screencast is and what you can expect from it before we start diving into the content. This screencast is going to accompany a hands-on lab and a training module that you can take advantage of that goes along with everything you're going to find in this screencast. Specifically, you're going to find in this screencast is really going to be an example of someone presenting the content from the training module as a way for you to learn how you could use this module and delivering it to a different user group or at a conference. However, you can also use it as self-paced learning. Now, the way that this module is set up is that it's broken up into a series of a couple different sections. We'll go through each one of them in just a few minutes. Each one of these sections is going to finish with a demonstration. Now, the demonstration, we don't walk through the entire step of creating the application or walking through the steps of writing all the code. Instead, we look at the final solution that has already been built and kind of pick through the code and pick through the important parts that you should take advantage of or you need to take note of. And we'll see it working as well. If you want to go through and you want to build the application, you want to see how it's being built, then what we would recommend that you do is go check out the hands-on lab that accompanies this module. Because the hands-on lab, each of the exercises maps to one of the demos inside of this screencast that you're going to see. So if you want to see how to build it and you want to walk through the steps, you can walk through the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module and get to the exact same place that we're showing you here in the screencast. Instead, we're not going to show in the screencast all the individual steps of creating the application. And part of that is because things change on a rapid cadence, and the lab is going to have the most updated steps and dependencies and stuff that you're going to need. The screencast is more or less showing you how the thing works or how the final solution works. So that's how you can learn more about taking advantage of this content and how we've structured this. Let's go ahead and dive into the actual module itself. In this section, we're going to start by looking at building ASP.NET MVC applications with the Microsoft Graph and leveraging the Microsoft Graph's .NET SDK. We're going to start by looking at an introduction to what the Microsoft Graph is and its API. Then we're going to jump into getting started on how to create an application, and then talk a little bit more about SDKs and code samples. Office 365 Developer Vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. And as a developer, you can bring your application into the user experience. With over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your application, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your application. There are currently over 850 million events created each month and a total of over 400 petabytes of data stored in the service that can add value for your users. The Microsoft Graph is the gateway to your data in the Microsoft Cloud. As you see there from the bottom of the list, we've got a lot of different services and data types that we can actually take advantage of from Office 365 and Microsoft. And it's all considered part of the Microsoft 365 platform. We can work with mail and calendar, contacts, tasks. We can work with content inside of SharePoint sites and lists, files inside of OneDrive, things inside of Microsoft Teams, users inside of Azure Active Directory. There's so many different things that we can take advantage of. The nice thing here is that each one of these different services usually has its own API where we can talk to these different services to get the data out. It can be challenging to go get the data from all these individual services as they each have their own endpoints, they may have their own permissions, and that also means that with their different access control that we have and talking to these different services using an OAuth style authentication via Azure Active Directory, that means that each one of these different endpoints is going to have to require their own access token. One of the nice things about the service called the Microsoft Graph is that the Microsoft Graph is going to serve as a proxy endpoint to all of these other different services. It's going to encompass things such as Office 365, Windows 10, and enterprise mobility and security. And it brings all of these different services under one top-level service called graph.microsoft.com. The advantage to using the Microsoft Graph is that it's going to allow you to just have a single point resource, which means you're only going to need a single access token to be able to talk to all these different services. They still have their own individual permissions, or as we refer to them as scopes, so that everything is still secured in a very individual way. But this makes it easier for developers to build applications. Now, the Microsoft Graph is your gateway to Office 365. And what I mean by that is that it is a single resource that proxies multiple Microsoft services. I'll talk more about this on the next slide. Now, it also allows for easy traversal of objects and relationships. So while there are lots of different Microsoft 365 services, such as talking to OneDrive or talking to Outlook for contacts and calendars, there's another one for tasks. One of the nice things about this is that how all of these different objects are related to each other, the Microsoft Graph has put those relationships into the graph, and it's built like a graph representation of all of these different endpoints. What's neat about that is that now I can easily traverse from one entity to another one, even if it crosses different endpoints, because the Microsoft Graph, they've merged all of these endpoints together for us. It also simplifies token acquisition because with all these different services in Microsoft 365, we would have to obtain a separate access token for each one of them. The reason for that is because every single service when you talk to a different service that has a different endpoint, you need a separate access token for each one. Well, when the Microsoft Graph proxies all these together, we no longer need to do that because all of them have the exact same endpoint and they're all going to go to the graph. And then the graph is going to make those calls on our behalf to those other services or other endpoints that we would need to connect to. This also is going to eliminate, or the graph is also going to eliminate the need for a traditional discovery service because like in the past, when we didn't have the graph, we had to make these calls to a discovery service to basically ask the different endpoints with Microsoft 365, where was my OneDrive endpoint or where was my Outlook endpoint? Because the URLs could be different based on the user and the tenant. We no longer need to do that. Now the graph can figure out all of that information for us by if we just go to the /me endpoint or the /my organization endpoint to get information about me or my tenant. Now, one of the nice things about the Office 365 API or the Microsoft Graph API is that I mentioned that they were like a proxy to other endpoints that each one of the different services implements. Like we have different Office 365 services and APIs for Outlook or for OneDrive or OneNote or Planner, Microsoft Teams, etc. Well, the nice thing about the graph is that, again, it's a proxy to all those services. So you don't have to know how to talk to each one of those services or obtain an access token for each one. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that because it's a proxy, you may see new functionality and features show up in these downstream endpoints prior to when they get them and they show up inside of the Microsoft Graph. And that makes sense because the Microsoft Graph is a proxy and it can't expose functionality that doesn't exist downstream in one of the services that it's proxying. So you may have to wait a little bit for it to show up either in the beta endpoint or in the V1 endpoint of the Microsoft Graph. Some examples of this are webhooks when they were introduced to Outlook, and also when time zones were introduced when the time zone support was introduced for calendar items. Now, Office 365 has a single authentication flow for Office 365 and the Microsoft Graph. Users are going to sign in using a technology called OpenID Connect, which is an open standard. And what that does is that once people have logged in, there's this nice little envelope wrapper that will include details about the individual who's just logged in. Azure AD is going to be used for all of the authentication. The Microsoft Graph is built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. Office 365 is also built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. So both of these services trust Azure AD. By having this single level of trust or single service that they both trust, then we can leverage the authentication to take advantage of both of these different services with the same authentication flow. This authentication flow is also going to support multi-factor authentication, also referred to as MFA, and federated user sign-ons. And it's going to support all different kinds of applications, from device applications such as those on a mobile device, websites, single-page applications that live 100% in the client, or as a headless application with no user involvement, also referred to as a daemon or as a service-based application. You'll be able to pin applications to your Office 365 app launcher from the My Apps page, which is like that little menu that you have in the top left corner within Office 365. Now, one of the concepts we have with Azure AD, and it comes into play with the Microsoft Graph, but it really is an Azure AD thing, and that's called the Common Consent Framework. So what happens is that if you think about permissions and being able to gain access to some service, you really have like a triangle of things that you need. We have the permission, we have the user or the application, and you have the resource that you're trying to talk to. So the resource is the Microsoft Graph, the user and the application, and then you also have the permission. So the user needs to have the permission to the resource to be able to talk to it. Well, the first time the user goes to log in to Azure AD to obtain an access token to talk to the graph, Azure AD is going to look and see, has this user granted this application access to the Microsoft Graph? And specifically, has it granted access to with these permissions? And so the way that this works is that if the user has not gone through this process yet, then the Common Consent Framework kind of kicks in. And after they log in, you'll see a dialog that looks a little bit like what you see there on the right of the slide. What this is saying is that effectively behind the scenes, it's saying you've never granted this permission to this endpoint with this application. So do you now grant that permission? And so what this is doing here, this is called the delegated consent. What this is doing is this is me granting a specific application. So in this case here, it says the publisher's website, what's the name of the app? I'm going to grant this permission to the Microsoft Graph. Or in this case specifically, is I'm just granting it to Azure AD. So reading directory data and signing me in and reading my profile. If I was talking to, say, my files or to my mail, it would have other permissions that were listed there as well. This is like an end user consent. I also have the ability to grant admin consent. And what that means is that is me as a tenant administrator granting these permissions by this application to a resource on behalf of everybody in my organization. That's a much more widespread permission that I'm granting. And it's not always required, but it is required at some point. So it's just an option that's available to you. Now, with the graph, we do have two ways that we can authenticate, or with Azure AD, there's two ways we can authenticate, and the graph supports both of them. Now, one way you can do is Azure AD only. And what this is that this says that you're only going to be using a work or school account to authenticate to the Microsoft Graph or to Azure AD, and then use that to go talk to that access token to talk to the Microsoft Graph. The other option is you can use converged auth, which is Azure AD and or Microsoft accounts. And in this case here, what's nice about this is that depending on how I log in, I use the exact same code in the Microsoft Graph, the same endpoints, the same SDKs to get my files either in OneDrive Consumer or OneDrive for Business. And I just use OneDrive as an example. The same is true for calendar and contacts and email inside of Outlook.com or in Exchange in Office 365. But the nice thing about this is that the data that you're going to go fetch is all dependent based on the login of the user that actually logged in. So I don't have to specify any special code or any special APIs or endpoints to get data for consumer accounts or for business accounts. Now, again, with the SharePoint framework, this doesn't really apply because we're only going to be logging into SharePoint Online using an Azure AD account and not a Microsoft account. Now, let's talk a little bit about Microsoft account and Azure AD accounts. This is something I just kind of mentioned a minute ago, where many apps will let you use either a Microsoft account and a Azure AD account, or I guess it's more of an or. The advantage here is that everything is the exact same. It's just a setting of what you support when you register the app inside of Azure AD. The Microsoft Graph has a single endpoint, single for all data, either business data or consumer data. Now let's talk a little bit about creating an ASP.NET web app for MVC that's been configured with the Microsoft Authentication Library and the OWYN middleware for authentication with Azure AD. So the way you're going to do this is you're first going to start by creating an ASP.NET MVC Web Application. So you can go through the process of creating the app, but you don't want to use the Visual Studio Wizard for configuring the authentication just yet. You want to just focus on creating the application itself. The second step is to ensure that your application is using SSL. So there is a redirect URL that it must be set up to use HTTPS in order to work with an Azure AD application. And then the next step is to configure your application for working with the ON middleware and the Microsoft Authentication library. This involves installing a handful of .NET or NuGet packages and then modifying the code in your project to make it work. So the Microsoft Authentication library and the ON middleware is all distributed using reusable packages. So these are the ones you're going to look at to include both the MSAL and ON middleware that we're going to need to use. So the last one that you see there, the Microsoft Identity Client, that is the Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL. And the ones above it are all the ON middleware. And what that does is those are things that MSAL are going to rely on. And it's using the ON middleware that's going to handle a lot of the communication from Azure AD back to our web app by intercepting things such as the access token, the authorization code, and things like that to be able to define and provide access tokens to your application that we're going to need to use with the Microsoft Graph. Now in this first demo, what we're going to do is we're going to go take an existing project and we're going to use that project to create and modify it to set it up to work with a new Azure AD application. We're going to take a look at how this project is set up and how it works. And in a future demo, I'm going to show you how to add all of the extra stuff that we need to get it to work with the Microsoft Authentication Library and Azure AD. So let's go ahead and dive into this demo. In this first demo in the screencast, we're going to look at how to create an ASP.NET MVC application that we're going to use throughout this other demos throughout in this screencast to demonstrate using Azure AD for authentication and to call the Microsoft Graph. Now, like the other Microsoft Graph related training modules and screencast, we're not going to walk through all the details of actually creating the application in this screencast or in this demo. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the application that we have already built. The reason we do this is because the version numbers and dependencies and UI for different selections can change over time, and so to keep things from getting confusing, what we've done is we've created a hands-on lab and a training module that accompanies this screencast. And so if you want to see the final version of this project, or if you want to walk through all the steps of creating this project, please refer to the training module that's associated with the screencast, and you can use that to go through a step-by-step of creating your own application. So what we've done here is I went ahead and I just said File, New Project, and then underneath the Web option, I chose an ASP.NET Web Application. So once I did that, the application's all been created. I then said that I wanted to use MVC as the style for the project and made sure everything was working. Now, once I did that, I then had to go through and go add in a bunch of additional NuGet packages. So if I come over here to the list of all the different packages that are available to me, what you can see is I installed a bunch of these ON middleware packages. So I've got ON for the host system web. I've got it for the OpenID Connect. I've got it for cookies. I've got it for also for Microsoft Identity Client. This is the Microsoft Authentication Library. And then I've got all the stuff that we need as well for the graph, talking to the Microsoft Graph. Once I did that, and I've installed all those different packages, I then went and created a ON startup class by creating this startup.cs class. And so what this is doing is I went ahead and created this class using the template for the ON startup class. And you can see here that what this does is it says you're going to go run ON startup, which is going to be listed right here under tutorial startup. Now this is just going through, it's a partial class that's being created with the configuration and passing in the app on how to go through and configure it. So we'll see how to do the authentication stuff in just a little bit more in just a minute. So underneath models, one of the things we did is we also created this alert. And this alert's just got 3 little properties in it. And we'll use this as a way to flash error messages in the different views of the application. Now, the next thing I did was to update the global layout of the application. So if I go over here into the shared view under /layout, what I did is I just updated the entire UI for my application. Now this is doing things like leveraging Bootstrap and setting up a whole bunch of stuff for our navigation. It just adds in Bootstrap for some styling and uses Font Awesome for some simple icons, and it also defines a global layout with a navigation bar and uses that alert class that we just defined a minute ago to display any alerts. I also, inside of the CSS file under site.css, I also added in a little bit of CSS here for some styling of my project. Now, let's look at the default page for the application. So underneath home /index.cshtml, what you can see here is I've created a application here with just this big Jumbotron, where is it? The Jumbotron right here that's part of Twitter Bootstrap. I've also specified if the user is currently authenticated, then I display the user. Otherwise, I display a sign-in button where they can sign in. Now, I'm going to create a little helper function to create an alert and pass it into the view in order to make things a little bit easier. So I'm going to do that inside of this base controller. So I've created a base controller, and I went through and I created this function here called flash, or this method called flash. And all this does is it takes in a message, and if we're in debug mode, and what it does, it's just going to create a collection of alerts and add those alerts to this little temp data collection here. So any controller can inherit from this base controller and gain access to the flash function to display things. So if I come back over here to my home controller, I'm going to go update this to use my base controller so that we can flash little messages. So now if I go run my application, it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't really do anything, but just take a look at it before we start adding in the authentication and calls to the Microsoft Graph. So here you can see our application up and running. And so here, if I click here to sign in, it's not going to work just yet because we haven't gone through and set up any of the details to go through and to sign in and to get this application actually running. That's what we're going to do in a future demo. So let's jump back to the slides and let's continue on with the slides. Now in this second section, we're going to focus mostly on the Azure AD piece. So we're going to look at how we can leverage the Azure Active Directory Authentication or Admin Center to register an application and set up the credentials and configure the kind of an application that we want to use. And then we're going to see how to modify our application to create everything we need and set it up to work with Azure AD. Let me talk a little bit about different endpoint versions that we have in Azure AD. We have a V1 endpoint and a V2 endpoint. V1 came first, obviously. V2 came second. Now, how did this work? Well, in the V1 endpoint, there was two characteristics to it that are worth noting here, and why we don't use it in a scenario for the Microsoft Graph anymore. One of the scenarios is that Azure AD only supported, in the V1 endpoint, only supported the Azure Active Directory authentication. It did not support any other styles of authentication. And so what that meant is that if the user was logging in with a personal account or consumer account, also known as a Microsoft account, and they wanted to access things like their OneDrive consumer account or their Outlook.com account, things like that, our application would have to know what kind of account they were signing in with, and we would have to send them to a whole different authentication model. So that's one downside, because Azure AD or the V1 endpoint only supported work and school accounts or accounts with that leveraged Azure AD. The other challenge that we had is that with a V1 endpoint, it required what's called static consent, which meant that every single permission that our application was going to need when the user first logged in, they were going to have to grant all the permissions up front at that time. They had to declare everything at the very first time. But what that's going to allow us to do then is that we don't have to worry about that extra complexity. We're going to let Azure AD figure all that out for us. So that's one nice thing. That's the first 2 points. Converged authentication accepts sign-in for both Microsoft personal accounts and Azure AD Work and School, and it enables the same code, the code that we write, for using the Microsoft Graph for things like reading mail and retrieving contacts. Now, the next thing that's really important here is the dynamic consent. And what's nice about this differs from V1, where we had static consent, where now every time you go to request a access token from Azure AD, you specify the permissions that you need for that access token. Now, let's say, for example, in the example I gave a minute ago, when the user went to log in, they had to grant all permissions that this application could possibly need up front. Well, now, when the user signs in, all I really need to do is I just need to request the user impersonation scope, and that's going to allow me to get information about the current user, just get their name, their email address, etc. And now they get a much better experience when they log into my app. Maybe they're only going to use the capability to reorganize their email into different folders. When they go to do that, I can request another access token that says I need mail.read and mail.write. And when I do that, then the user is only going to be prompted for those permissions if they had not already granted those permissions to the app. The next time they go to use the app, same thing. It's going to go check to see, we need these permissions. Azure AD says, I can tell this user has already granted those permissions, so we don't need to go through that whole process a second time. But we don't have to request permissions for their calendar, for their tasks, or for their files in OneDrive. We only need to ask for that stuff when they actually need it. So I think that's a better experience because your users aren't hit with a lot of stuff. And you've seen a similar model with this, like on your mobile devices. An application may, like if you were going to use one of these social apps and you wanted to post something to this social network, let's say you just want to post some text. Well, it doesn't need a permission for that. But then if you wanted to, say, post a picture that you had taken, they need access to your photos on your phone. And so it prompts you for, do you grant this application access to your photos? Yes or no. The next thing is maybe I want to take a picture and have it send right away. So then it's going to ask for permissions to your camera. Or you want to do a little video. So now it wants permissions to your camera and your microphone. If you had installed the app and the first time you went to log in, it says, I need access to your microphone and your camera and your photos, you may be a bit turned off by the app and say, I don't want to give you all those permissions. I just want to post some text to this social network. That's what dynamic consent is all about. It allows you to incrementally just grant these permissions. And you can learn more about the V2 endpoint if you go to aka.ms/aadv2. Now let me talk about some of the other improvements from the V1 endpoint to the V2 endpoint. In the V1 endpoint, you had to provide a resource parameter to identify which resources you were requesting an access token for. And the challenge with this is that some of the open source libraries were not able to easily incorporate that into their requests. So now we use the scope parameter, which is supported by all the libraries to compound and combine both the resource and the permission. When you build applications with Azure AD V1, you also had to register all the permissions the application needed. That was called static consent. We just went through that a minute ago. The user had to consent to all of those things statically, but with V2, we can now send scopes that you want at the time you want them. We don't have to ask for them all up front. That's the dynamic consent. We're also going to change the contents of the ID token. This is the token that is going to be included with the response for the login that contains information about the current user, like their email address and their name, etc. And this is going to better conform to the OpenID Connect V1 specification. For example, we're using things like preferred username claim instead of a claim called UPN. And also in the past, if you needed a client application or a single page application or a web app or a web API or a daemon service, we had to create multiple Azure AD registrations and wire up each of the relationships between each one of those. And it was a bit of a pain. But now in the V2, this now is going to enable us just one app registration across a single logical application. And we can then open up all the different areas that we support for the different applications, such as representing a native and a web application if we wanted to. For more information, you can use that link at the bottom of the slide to learn more about the V1 versus V2 key improvements. Now let me talk a little bit about working with the different SDKs when it comes to Azure AD. Now the nice thing about this is that you really are going to self-select yourself into which one you're going to use. If you're using the V1 Authentication Endpoint, you have to use the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL. It only works with V1. If you're going to be using the V2 endpoint with the dynamic consent and some of the other things we've talked about, which is the recommendation from the Microsoft Graph team, you're going to be using the Microsoft Authentication Library. This targets the V2 endpoint. It's got a new conceptual model of two different kinds of applications. One's called a public client app and one's called a confidential client app. A confidential client is one that has runs in a web experience where you can put both the client ID and the secret in the application. Where a public client application is one going to be more like a native app, where I'm not going to be able to provide the secret. I'm only going to be providing the client ID. We also have a couple different platforms on where this is supported. There's MSAL.net for .NET Client, Windows Store, ASP or .NET Core, Android, iOS, Xamarin, Universal Windows platform. There's a JavaScript implementation, an Objective-C implementation for iOS and macOS, and an Android implementation as well. Now, where are we going to register our applications? This has changed a little bit over the years, but now where we would recommend that you go is to go to the Azure AD admin portal. That's at aad.portal.azure.com. Now, there's a bunch of advantages to using this. First advantage here is that you don't need to have a Azure subscription to get to the Azure AD admin portal. You can log in with either a Microsoft account or an Azure AD account. And you'll see in the demo, when we log into this, it looks like the Azure portal, except the options of all the different Azure resources that are available to us are all gone except for Azure AD. This new admin portal is also going to allow you to create and manage both V1 and V2 style Azure AD applications. So you can have access to both the V1 and the V2 authorization endpoints. You're also going to be able to leverage either ADAL or MSAL for authentication. And again, as I said in the last slide, that really is going to be dictated based on what you end up doing with using either the V1 or the V2 endpoint. But because we're dealing with a Microsoft Graph, as I said before, you really are going to want to focus on using the V2 endpoint. Now let's talk about how we register an Azure AD application using the Azure AD Admin Center or Admin Portal. Application registration starts by creating a brand new application. You're going to do that over that you see on the left-hand side by selecting, I want to create a new application. Once you create your new application, you're also probably going to want to define at the same time or in a subsequent step the redirect URI that you're going to want to specify. Now what this is this is going to be telling Azure AD when a user logs in, what URLs are you allowed to redirect them to? And so I need to whitelist the URL for my web application. When you're doing this in development, you're probably going to be pointing to a local host, but when you do it in production, you're going to want to change it to point to your well-formed URL or well-known URL. Because we're working with what are called confidential clients, which is a way for us to secure both the client ID and the secret, I'm going to need to create a secret for my app. And think of this as like the password for my application that it's going to use to log in with Azure AD. You're going to create the secret. This is going to be shown just one time. So after you create it, make sure you create a copy of it. You can always create a second one, but it's for security, it's only going to be shown once. And then the last step is you can optionally set API permissions. And these are permissions that my app is going to need in order to talk to whatever resource. So if I wanted to talk to the Microsoft Graph, then I could specify the permissions that we want to use. Now, this is dealing with what's called static consent, to where I'm defining the permissions up front. But the Microsoft Authentication Library and the V2 endpoint, as I've already discussed in this screencast, we have the ability to set it up for dynamic consent, which means that we can define the permissions we need at the time that we're actually running the app. So let's see a demo on going through and creating our application. So we're going to create our Azure AD application, and then after we create it, we are then going to go modify or see how we've modified our application in order to use the settings for our app registration that we created with Azure AD. In this section, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new Azure AD web app registration using the Azure Active Directory admin portal. And then once we do that, we're then going to go update the application to use the new Azure AD application that we've just now created. So what you're going to want to do is you want to double check on what the URL is for your application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the application, and then I'm going to come over here and open up the properties window. So come down here and select properties window. And then I'll go ahead and just move this up here to make it easier to see. So we'll select properties, and what you want to do is you want to take note of what this URL is. That's going to be where your application is going to load. You're going to need that in just a minute. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to come back over here, and we're going to go create a new app registration. So I'm going to create this new app registration, and I'm going to call this my ASP.NET Graph Tutorial. And I'm going to specify that we can use any account to test this out with. Doesn't matter what it's going to be. And go ahead and click register to go ahead and create the application. And once I do that, I'm then going to come over here to the redirect URI, and I'm going to specify the URL that I want to redirect to be equal to the URL that we have in our application that we just saw a minute ago. Now, furthermore, if I scroll down a little bit, I'm also going to tell it that I want to get ID tokens back as well. That's just something that we're going to want to use inside of our application. So I'm going to go ahead and save my changes. Now, before I go much further than this, let's go back to the details for our application, and let's copy the ID of our application. We're going to need that. So over here in Visual Studio, I'm just going to create a new file real quick. Just a text file, and we're going to put in our ID right there. We'll come back and we'll use that in just a minute. Now, the next thing we need to do is I need to come over here to our certificates and secrets, and I need to create a new certificate or secret for my application. So I'm going to create a new secret. I'll call this my 1-year certificate or password. And then I'm going to copy my secret, and I'm also going to put that over here inside Visual Studio because we're going to need that in just a minute. All right. So now that that's done, let's now go back to our application and let's go update our application to use the stuff that we just created. So I come back over here to Visual Studio and go to my app. Let's look in the web config. And in the web config, we don't see anything here where we can actually put in our password. And in fact, we don't see that because, here we go. We have a private settings.config. So let's rename this, get rid of the .example off the end of it. And I'm going to go pass in the secret. So I'll just grab that, put that right here. Oh, I didn't paste it right. Let's grab it again. Copy. Paste. And then I need the ID. Like that. And then I need to specify the port. So if you remember, our application was on port 64107. So just copy this entire, let's see, 64107. So 64107. There we go. So you can see here we got a couple different settings that have been defined here. So now let's come back over here to our web config and let's make sure that our private settings are going to be listed. And yes, they are. Good. Okay, so what I want to do is I need to go update our application to be able to use all this, Azure AD for our authentication. So I'm going to go to startup auth.cs, and I've added in a bunch of references here for being able to leverage the Microsoft Owen middleware and the Microsoft Authentication Library for authentication. So if I open this up, go full screen, what you'll see here is some of the first things we're doing is we're fetching the app ID, the secret, the redirect URI, and the scopes from the settings that we created earlier. I then have gone through and I've added in some other stuff to handle the authentication. So here we're going to be creating our OpenID Connect authentication setup. I'm going to set that up first. I'm going to specify the client ID. I'm going to specify the authority. And when you say common like this, that's saying that let Azure AD figure out where this, what the authority is. I could specify just my tenant ID here, and that would make it so that people only inside my tenant could log in. I'm defining all the scopes that we want. So here's some default scopes plus the ones that we have in our private settings configuration file. And we set some other stuff up here as well. Now a little bit farther down, what's going to happen is that when an authentication code is received, we're going to want to run this code right here, authorization code received. Now, when you get an authorization code, what that's going to do is that's simply going to give the application this code that the application can then use to go fetch an access token for a specific user. So we get this authorization code that's going to get returned back. Here I'm going to call the confidential client application builder for this app ID that we've created in Azure AD. I'm going to use this redirect URI and this secret. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call, let's see a little bit farther down here, I'm going to use the ID client, so the one that we've created up here. acquire a token using the authorization code. And I'm going to use that code that was passed in. And I want a code with these scopes on it. So what that's going to do is it's going to prompt the user to grant permission for an access token with these scopes. And if they haven't granted permission for those scopes, then we will be prompted to go authenticate again. Once that's done, I then have my access token, and I can then go get information about the user by using this graph helper class that we've created to go fetch some information about the end user. Now let's see where this is actually being implemented. If I come back over here to my app and I go over here to my controllers, inside of the controllers, you can see where I have an account controller now that I've defined. So on my sign-in controller, what this is going to do when I click sign in, if the user is not authenticated, then I'm going to call the get ON context on authentication. I'm going to issue a challenge. And what that's going to do is that's what's going to prompt the user or redirect them to the Azure AD login page. I'm going to say redirect them back to the current URL of the site, and the authentication type or the defaults we're using is the authentication type enumeration that's been provided for us. And on sign out, basically just does the inverse. I'm going to clear everything out. So find who the current user is. I want to make sure I remove them from this session store, the session state that is created by the Microsoft Authentication Library. And then I'm going to clear out the session store, and then I'm going to go ahead and sign them out and redirect them back to the home page. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier was you saw that I had a graph helper, and what that was doing was that was fetching information about the current user. So this is something that we have created. We'll see a little bit more detail about working with the graph in the next demo, but in this one, we're going to do something really simple. We're going to get a new instance of the graph client, and we do that by using this delegate authentication provider, which is part of the coming from the Microsoft Graph. Once we've done that, we're going to say, I want to go, once we've authenticated, I want to make sure that we are going to add in to the graph client. I want to add into every single request that comes in an authorization header to the HTTP request with the value of bearer space and then passing in the access token. So then that's going to use the graph client to say, graph client, go to the .me endpoint, issue a request asynchronously, and that's what's going to give me back a user object back here. So let's see this work. So I'm going to come over here and let's go ahead and run the application. And it's going to prompt me to sign in. So we're going to come to the application. Let's go ahead and let's sign in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click sign in. And it already knew that I was logged in as the current user. So it went ahead and it signed me in. Now let's see what that experience looks like again. So let me go ahead and sign out. And I'm going to go click sign in again. And it already has my information already cached on the current machine. So it's already stored in a cookie. So let's try this in a private window. Let's go to the same URL. We'll go ahead and sign in. We'll use the same account we were using before. And then we'll put our password in. And we've already granted the permission, so we shouldn't have to go through and have a permission request. But we can see it is getting information about the current user. So we can now see that we're currently logged in, and we can even see the email address is coming back as well. So at this point, the application has an access token, which has been set in the authorization header of the API calls. And this is the token that's going to allow the app to access the Microsoft Graph on the user's behalf. However, this token's got a short life to it. It expires in about an hour. And this is where the refresh token becomes useful, because the refresh token is going to allow the app to request a new access token without requiring the user to sign in again. And the way that's doing that is because the Microsoft Authentication Library and the token cache object is being used, so I don't have to implement any token refresh logic. When I call the method acquire token silently async, that is what's going to do all of the logic for us. It first checks to see, do I have a cache token? And if it's not, or if it's expired, then if it does have one with those scopes and it's not expired, it'll return it. Otherwise, if it is expired, or if it's going to expire in the next minute, then it will use the cached refresh token to obtain a new one. And I'm going to use that one in the I can use that one in another option, or in a separate request. So in this sample, you saw how to create an Azure AD application. We walked through the code inside of an ASP.NET application, MVC app, on how it is going to fetch the token and log the user in and fetch the token. In this last section, we're going to look at how to leverage the Microsoft Graph inside of our ASP.NET application. We're going to talk a little bit about the NuGet packages that we're going to need in order to talk to the Microsoft Graph, a little bit more about authenticating with Azure AD, and then we're going to look at how to create an instance of the GraphService client. So the Microsoft Graph.NET SDK is made available to us through a NuGet package, and if you can find that by just looking for Microsoft.graph. It has a dependency package that's associated with it, but it'll install that when you install the NuGet package. So how do I obtain what's called a GraphService client? And what that is that is going to be the actual API that we're going to use to talk to the Microsoft Graph. So first, I'm going to obtain an access token from Azure AD by authenticating. Now here what you can see is I'm saying get a user access token asynchronously. And what we're doing is we're leveraging the Microsoft Authentication library to do that. So I'm creating something called a confidential client, and I'm using the confidential client application builder to create our confidential client app. I do that by calling the create and passing in the ID of my Azure AD app, and then passing in the secret and the redirect URI of where we can go back. So then I'm going to call .build. Once that's done, I'm then going to be able to use that client, the CCA, to go through and obtain the access token. So if you see a little bit farther down on the slide, see where it says CCA.acquire token silent. That's going to pass in a list of scopes, so all the permissions that I want my application to request access for. And then I'm going to also say I'm only looking for the account, the current account that's logged in. I execute that asynchronously. That's going to handle all the authentication stuff and then go obtain the access token for me. That silent method, the acquire token silent, what that's doing in the background is that's going to look and see, do I already have an access token for this user that is not expired? And if the answer is that yes, you do have one that's not expired, then we're going to use that access token. If you do have one that is expired, then it will try to reach out using the refresh token over to Azure AD to obtain a new access token that's been refreshed. And it can do that using the refresh token. And when it receives that, it'll update its token store, or otherwise known as a token cache. If that doesn't work, then you have to trigger a interactive login, which is going to redirect the user over to Azure AD to log in. That is probably going to happen. That's definitely going to happen the first time they use the web app, but it may happen if they haven't used the web app for a very long time. Once you obtain the access token, you're then going to need to create an instance of the Microsoft Graph API, and you do that by creating an instance of the GraphService client. So the way you do that is you're going to create this thing called a delegate authentication provider. And so here I'm going to create a new provider, and I'm going to pass into the provider an anonymous function. So in this case here, I'm passing in the request message that comes back. So this is the message that the request that I get from when the Microsoft Graph is going to reach out to call them, the SDK reaches out to the REST API. This request message, this is going to fire when the request actually happens. And so in this case here, this is where I'm going to go get a reference to my access token. And then once I get the access token, I can then include it in the request header, specifically the authorization header, and I pass in the value of bearer space with the access token. That is going to give me the Graph client back. And I can use that Graph client making calls to the REST API. So what does the experience look like for our end user? The user is first going to be prompted to sign in, and that's going to redirect them over to Azure AD. And once they sign in, the very first time they are hitting the site, they have never granted this application permissions to the Microsoft Graph. In addition, though, they very well may not have, they may be requesting a new permission, or the app may be requesting a new permission that the user has yet to grant it access to. And so in this case here, the user is going to be prompted to grant consent to the app if admin consent has not already been granted to the entire tenant. And then finally, you see that we have the graph data that is being returned. Once I have my access token, then I can very easily use the Microsoft Graph.NET SDK to issue a request to the Microsoft Graph REST API to fetch data for my current user. In this case, we're getting calendar events. So as an overview on what happens with this entire process, again, the user is going to load the web application and say, I want to sign in. That's going to redirect them over to the Microsoft Online, which is the Azure AD Authorization and Authentication Endpoints. The user is going to authenticate. It's going to be redirected back to the application, the web app. That's going to give them what's called an authorization code. That code is going to be given to our web app, who then server side is going to make a call to Azure AD and ask for an access token by exchanging the authorization code. Once it has that access token, it can then make a call to the Microsoft Graph to fetch all my calendar items using the SDK, and that's going to give me back all of those items that I can then display in the browser. Now, how does this whole thing work? Once the access token is required or acquired, your application is going to continue to call the Graph API without having to go through the steps to obtain the access token again. Instead, it just caches it locally and it keeps using it. And at some point, the token is going to expire. A refresh token is used to obtain a new access token without requiring the user to sign in again. To understand why the MSAL library is important, it's necessary to understand what it's handling for you. Your code is going to follow a simple pattern to acquire a token silently, and if that fails, acquire it interactively. What I mean by that is that silently is going to try and fetch the token using a refresh token if it already has a token that may have expired. And if it doesn't work and it requires me to interactively log in, then it's going to prompt me to go log in. Your code doesn't need to manage the login pop-up screen, the interaction for obtaining the consent, and it does not also need to manage the lifetime of the token. That MSAL does all that for you. The call to the common/OAuth v2 authorized endpoint is going to pop up a login screen and request a permissions consent, or the common consent framework. It's important to cache the refresh token to a request with a new access token, and the MSAL library is going to do that for you. There's no action for you as the developer to manage the refresh token. You can create a custom cache for persistence, but MSAL is going to manage all of that stuff for you. It is just important to understand, though, what the MSAL library is doing for you. And now let's see a demo on how we've gone through and configured our application to fetch calendar items from the Microsoft Graph and display them in the browser. Now, in this last demo, we're going to see how we've incorporated the Microsoft Graph.NET SDK into the application to make calls to the Microsoft Graph to get calendar items from Outlook for the current user. So what I've got, if I go back to my Graph Helper method, and what you're going to see that we've done is, if I scroll down a little bit, we've already had this method of getting the user details. What you're going to see now is I have this other method here of getting events async. And so what this does is this is going to get a reference to an authenticated client. Now, how does this work? Well, we saw this in the last section, where this is going to be creating a delegate authentication provider. That's going to go create an instance of the client. And then all I'm doing here is I'm going to be saving the information about the currently logged in user into a token store, fetching all of the accounts, listing those inside in this property here for the accounts. And then I'm also going to go grab a list of all the scopes that we want, so that have been defined. And those were inside that ID client. That was our object that we have for all of our custom properties and that we've defined with the ID and the secret, etc. So the authorization client, what that does is that's going to initialize our GraphService client, and then that can be used right here to then go call the graphclient.me.events and creating a request, and then passing on additional parameters to say I'm only interested in specific properties and I want to sort based on a specific values here. Now, inside, where are we going to display this? Well, this is all going to be displayed inside of our new calendar controller. So our calendar controller is based off of our base class. We can see here we're calling the Graph Helper. We first have to be authorized, so you can't get here unless you're authenticated. Once you're authenticated, we know we already have a access token. And so all of this authentication stuff, we're not going to have to worry about the authentication piece behind the scenes here, because this is going to be fetching the access token from our token store, or it uses the refresh token to refresh that token. Anyway, once we get our graph helper, we then call get events async, the method we just looked at. That'll give us a collection of events back. And then here I can walk through all those events and I can fetch out each one of the events. And in this case here, all I'm doing is I'm modifying the date time. I'm converting it to a local time. Same thing with the time zone, converting that to local and the end time to local. So this is just modifying the start and end date for the results we got back to be against our local times. And then I'm returning that back to the view. And then to display this, I'm going to use a standard MVC template or an MVC view over in our calendar for our index. And if I open that up, you can see here that I'm simply creating a table, and then I'm going to walk through all the items in the model and then write out the name of the person that requested it, the subject of the event in my calendar, and then the start and the end date of the calendar as well. So let's see this run. So I'm going to go ahead and start this up. And just to go through the entire process, I'm going to grab the URL for this, and we're going to go to a private browser. So let's come over here and let's open up our private browser where we're not currently logged in. Let's go ahead and sign out. And now let's go ahead and sign in. It actually remembered us. Now we can come over here to our calendar. When I select calendar, it's now going to show us a result, all the results from our calendar for using the Microsoft Graph REST API to make the request. So it makes it really easy to go fetch the requests or fetch events from our calendar using the Microsoft Graph and using the Microsoft Authentication library that's been provided to us. The two work hand in hand really well. If you would like to see the entire code for this solution, or if you'd like to walk through all the steps of creating this application, again, like I mentioned at the beginning of the first demo, if you check the training module that is associated with this screencast, you will find the built solution for all of these applications, and you will also find the hands-on lab that walks you through a demo for each one and exercises for each one of the different demos that we've done throughout this module. Now we've reached the end of this screencast for this module. You've seen a lot about how to do development with the Microsoft Graph based on the topic that we've covered here. Keep in mind that everything you saw here inside the screencast accompanies a training module where you can find slides and hands-on labs and all the final solutions that we showed you in the demos inside this screencast. So if you want to learn more, I'd recommend you check out the module associated with this screencast. Again, if you remember, the demonstrations that we showed you in this screencast, they don't walk you through every single step of building the application. Rather, we just look at the final solution that we've built and we see it running, which you can expect to see. If you want to see how to go about building a solution just like this, go look at the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module, because each of the demos corresponds with a specific exercise from the hands-on lab. So we have steps where you can walk through each one of these things. Again, one of the reasons we don't do all of the individual steps in the screencast is because things change on a very rapid cadence in this new cloud world, and different dependencies change, version numbers change, maybe a couple steps in screen caps are going to change as well in the hands-on lab. And so we keep the hands-on labs updated every couple months. But the videos would get out of date really quick if we tried to do that. So to save a little bit of time, we've just showed you the final solution, and we maintain the hands-on labs that you can take advantage of. I hope you got a lot out of this. There are a lot of other training modules associated with the Microsoft Graph that I'd recommend that you definitely take a look at. We've also got a couple additional links here that are at the end of the slides in the training module where you could use to learn more about this technology. So again, hope you got a lot out of this and you enjoyed this screencast. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch it.